right, diving in today. And, we always pick really exciting topics, and today is no different. Ever wonder what it's like talking to the FDA or trying to navigate international guidelines when you're trying to get a new drug, from the lab to
Mhm.
actually helping people?
It's definitely a process, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah. And that's what we're breaking down today, specifically those super early clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2. These can make or break a new medicine, right?
They really can. And how you communicate with those regulatory bodies, the FDA and the ICH, during these early phases, it's not just a box to check. It's a huge part of setting you up for success, or, frankly, for some pretty big headaches down the road.
Headaches, I think, is putting it mildly. But that's why we're doing this deep dive. It's all about understanding the best practices for communicating with regulators, what kind of questions they're going to have, and how you adapt, on the fly based on their feedback. So we've got a ton of really interesting material to work with today.
We do. Everything from the very specific legal frameworks that the FDA operates under to some more sort of broader perspectives on drug development as a whole.
Excellent. So let's get right to it. The FDA, the ICH, these are the big names everyone's heard of, right? They're essentially the gatekeepers, making sure everything is safe and effective before a drug can ever reach patients.
Absolutely. They're ultimately responsible for protecting public health. Now, the FDA here in the US, they operate under a very specific legal framework, and it can seem a little daunting at first. We're talking about acts like the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Big name, big implications. But a key part we need to focus on today is Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, especially Part 312.
Part 312, okay.
This is essentially the rulebook for investigational new drug applications, your IND. It's your formal request to say, hey, FDA, we want to start testing this new drug in humans. And trust me, understanding these regulations inside and out is not optional. It's your first step to effective communication because it sets the rules of the game.
Got it. So IND, your ticket to the game. What about the ICH? They're the international folks, right?
Right. The International Council for Harmonization, they bring together regulatory authorities from all over the world, trying to make sure the technical guidelines for drug development are consistent across the globe.
So it's not just about what the U.S. wants.
Yeah.
It's about a more global standard.
Exactly. Their guidelines may not be legally binding like the FDA regulations are here, but they carry a lot of weight. They really influence what regulators all over the world expect to see, so you got to pay attention to both.
Okay, so say I'm a researcher and I'm heading into these early clinical trials, phase I and II. What's the big picture? What information am I trying to gather at this stage? And what are those regulators going to be zeroing in on?
So phase I and phase II, you're essentially laying the foundation. You're figuring out, okay, how does this drug behave in humans? What does it do to the body? What does the body do to the drug? That's your pharmacodynamics and your pharmacokinetics.
Right, right. We hear those terms thrown around a lot.
Yeah, so pharmacodynamics, think of it like this. It's what the drug does to the body. Like, does it lower blood pressure? Does it kill cancer cells? That kind of thing. Pharmacokinetics is, well, imagine the drug is on a little journey through the body. Pharmacokinetics is tracking that journey. How's it getting absorbed? Where's it going? How's it breaking down? How's it leaving the body?
Okay, so it's like the drug's travel itinerary,
Oh,
essentially.
pretty much. And phase I is all about safety. So you're starting to figure out what's a safe dose range, what are the side effects.
So we're talking, first time in humans, really careful monitoring, small groups of people.
Exactly, you're really dipping your toes in the water. Then you move on to phase II, and you're starting to look at efficacy. Okay, is this drug actually doing what we think it should be doing? Does it show promise in treating the condition we're targeting? And you're still, of course, keeping a close eye on safety at those doses.
Right, because a drug might be safe but just not effective or vice versa.
That's right. So by the end of phase II, you and the regulators should have a pretty good understanding of the drug's potential benefits and its risks. And that shared understanding, that's where those crucial conversations with the agencies really start to take shape.
Okay, I get it, laying the groundwork. But here's a question. Given that the FDA and ICH are all about safety and making sure things are done right, it almost feels a little counterintuitive to actively reach out to them early on. Isn't there a risk of, inviting extra scrutiny?
That's a really common concern. It's like, oh, if I don't talk to them, maybe they won't notice anything. But honestly, that's the opposite of what you want. Early and open communication, it's not about poking the bear. It's about building a relationship. Think of it like, getting to know your neighbors. If you start off on the right foot, it's a lot easier to work things out down the line.
So it's more like, hey, we're doing this cool thing. Come be a part of it from the start.
Exactly. It's about transparency and collaboration. By engaging early, you can get a much clearer idea of what those regulatory expectations really are. And that can save you a ton of time and headaches later on.
Makes sense.
No.
Catch those potential problems before they become, full-blown regulatory
Yeah.
roadblocks.
For example, I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies get tripped up over something as simple as the starting dose in a phase I trial. Maybe their preclinical data showed a certain safety margin, but if they don't clearly explain that to the FDA and justify their chosen human dose, it can lead to a lot of back and forth delays, frustration.
So it's like, show your work. Don't just assume they'll get it.
Precisely. Show your work, be transparent, and build that trust early on. It really does pay off.
Okay, so that's the why of proactive communication. But how do you actually do it effectively? What are some practical tips for researchers who are, maybe new to this whole dance with the regulators?
Well, first and foremost, clarity is king. Any communication you have with the FDA or ICH, whether it's a formal document or just a quick email response, it needs to be clear, concise, and give them all the information they need.
No jargon, no burying the lead.
Exactly. And a little tip I always give people, whenever you're sending a written communication, start with a super brief summary of the key questions you're addressing. It shows the reviewers that you respect their time, helps them focus on the core of what you're saying.
Like a little table of contents almost.
Exactly. Now, beyond clarity, you also need to stay up to date. The FDA and ICH guidelines, they're not static. They evolve, so you got to keep learning, especially those IND requirements we talked about earlier, Part 312, that's your Bible.
Right, because if you miss something crucial in that IND application, that's not going to go over well.
Not at all. And remember, you're providing a ton of detailed information. It's not just, hey, we have this new drug. It's here's everything about it, how it's made, what's in it, how pure it is, all that CMC stuff. Here's our preclinical data. Here are the studies we've done in animals. And here's exactly how we plan to study it in humans.
So it's just like building a really detailed case file.
Absolutely. You want to leave no room for doubt. And then, of course, you've got your clinical trial protocols, your detailed plan for how the study will be run. All of that needs to be crystal clear.
All right, so we've got our meticulously crafted IND, we've submitted it, our phase I trial is underway, and then boom, we get a list of questions and concerns from the FDA. What's the best way to handle that?
Don't panic. This is normal. It's part of the process. The key is to be prepared. Have a dedicated team ready to jump on those queries quickly and efficiently. And when you respond, back everything up with data.
So it's not just, well, we think this or we feel that.
No, it's here's the data from our preclinical studies. Here's what we're seeing in the clinical trial so far. Here's the published literature that supports our approach. You want to be able to point directly to the evidence that supports your decisions.
Data.
That's the name of the game. And I've seen this firsthand. I had a client once who was anticipating a tough question from the FDA about a potential safety signal based on their early animal studies. So what did they do? They proactively prepared this really thorough analysis, even created some visual summarizing the data. They compared it to existing treatments. And when the FDA did raise the question, bam, they were ready. The regulators were really impressed with how prepared they were.
It's like they were anticipating the next chess move.
Exactly. And it saved them so much time and back and forth. It really smoothed things over. So be proactive, be data-driven, and you'll be in a much stronger position.
And what if, during this whole back and forth, the FDA or ICH suggests that you need to change something about your trial? Maybe they have concerns about, who you're enrolling, the dose you're testing, even the endpoints, what you're measuring as the outcome. How do you handle that?
Well, that's where flexibility comes in. You have to remember, the FDA and ICH, they're the experts. They see a lot of data, a lot of trials. So if they raise a concern, it's usually for a good reason. They're looking out for patient safety, for the scientific integrity of the trial. So you got to be willing to adapt.
So it's not like my way or the highway.
Not at all. It's a collaboration. Maybe they suggest narrowing your inclusion criteria to focus on a specific patient population, or adjusting the dose, or adding a new endpoint, or even revising your statistical analysis plan. Those are all things that can happen.
It's like a constant fine-tuning based on the feedback you're getting.
Exactly. And if you need to make significant changes, you'll have to submit a formal amendment to your IND. That gets reviewed and approved before you can implement the changes.
So it's a back and forth. It's not just a one-and-done submission.
Absolutely. It's a dialogue, a partnership.
Okay, so we've talked about the why and the how of communicating with regulators, but our listeners always love real-world examples. Now, I know the sources we have don't give us, transcripts of those early conversations, but are there any related concepts that we can pull in to illustrate these points?
For sure. I mean, think about it. Drug development is becoming more and more complex, right? You've got all these new technologies, new types of therapies, and that just inherently demands a lot more planning, a lot more communication with the agencies to navigate all the complexities. That's something we see emphasized again and again in the literature.
Like the more complex the science gets, the more important that clear communication becomes.
Exactly. And another thing, one of the sources really hammered home the importance of having really robust bioanalytical methods for measuring those pharmacokinetic parameters we talked about earlier.
The drug's travel itinerary.
Right. So you have to be able to accurately measure how the drug is behaving in the body. If your methods are sloppy, if they're not well documented, the regulators are going to have a lot of questions, and that's going to slow things down.
So solid science, solid methods, solid documentation, that's all part of the communication package.
Absolutely. And, it's also interesting to see that there can be some differences in regulatory perspectives between agencies. Like the FDA might have a slightly different take on something compared to the European Medicines Agency, the EMA.
Right, because drug development is a global endeavor these days.
It is, and that's why those early conversations are so crucial. You want to understand those different viewpoints early on so you can address potential concerns and maybe even bridge those gaps in your development strategy.
So think globally, communicate proactively.
Exactly. And remember, one of the biggest takeaways from our sources is that emphasis on CMC information in your IND. That's the chemistry, manufacturing, and control. They really scrutinize that stuff. So any ambiguity there, any missing information, it's going to lead to questions, it's going to lead to delays.
So be thorough, be clear, leave no room for interpretation.
Right.
And speaking of regulations, you mentioned 21 CFR Part 312 a few times. Are there any other specific regulations or ICH guidelines that are super relevant to this early communication process?
Yeah, so Part 312, it's really comprehensive. It lays out everything the FDA expects to see in your IND. The CMC details, the preclinical data, the proposed clinical trial protocols. It also tells you how to submit amendments to your IND and how to report any safety issues that come up during your trials. Now, our sources didn't really dive into specific ICH guidelines that focus just on early communication, but there are a ton of ICH guidelines that influence global standards for clinical trials.
Right, because the ICH is all about harmonizing things internationally.
Exactly. And one really important set of guidelines is ICH Good Clinical Practice, GCP. That applies to all phases of clinical trials, but it really sets the bar for ethical and scientific quality. It tells you how to design, conduct, record, and report your trials. And following those GCP principles is essential. It directly impacts the quality of the data you're communicating to regulators.
So it's not just about what you say, it's about how you got the data in the first place.
Absolutely. And one other thing, one of the sources mentions specific ICH guidelines, S3A and S3B, that deal with pharmacokinetic and toxicokinetic studies in animals. So those give you really specific guidance on the types of data regulators expect to see early on.
Okay, so lots of specific guidelines to keep in mind, but one final point that I think is really important, I know you've alluded to this before, it's not just about bombarding the regulators with information, right?
Oh, yeah. You can definitely overwhelm them. That's a recipe for disaster. Remember, they have a ton of applications to review, a ton of data to sift through, so your goal should be to make their lives easier, not harder.
So quality over quantity.
Absolutely. Think about it like writing a good paper. You want to be clear, concise, well organized. You want to get your point across without burying it in a mountain of unnecessary detail.
So when communicating with regulators, less is often more.
Absolutely. Focus on the key data, the key interpretations, present it in a logical way. A well-structured submission, it's like a breath of fresh air for those reviewers.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are the essential takeaways for our listeners about this whole idea of proactive communication with regulatory agencies during those early clinical trials?
I think the core message is this. Proactive communication, it's not just a box to check. It's a crucial part of successful drug development. Understand the regulatory landscape, the FDA's requirements, the ICH guidelines. Build that collaborative relationship with the agencies early on. Be transparent, be clear, be data-driven, and be ready to adapt.
And by doing all that, you're not just navigating the regulations, you're actually helping to accelerate the development of those innovative therapies that are going to ultimately make a difference in people's lives.
And, it really gets me thinking, when you look at the big picture, how much does that early, proactive, collaborative dialogue with regulators shape the whole trajectory of a drug development program? I mean, think about it. From those first conversations about your IND all the way through to approval and beyond, that open communication can really make or break a drug's success.
So it's not just about getting a drug approved. It's about getting it approved efficiently, safely, and ultimately making sure it reaches the patients who need it most.
Exactly. And that's something I think we all need to keep in mind. It's a shared responsibility.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, thanks for listening to another episode of The Deep Dive. Catch you next time.
See you then.